Welcome everyone to another episode of Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster. With me, as always, is my trusty co-host, Mr. Jared Kozel. How are you doing today, Jared?
Excellent. As we were talking about off screen, it was a busy week. I started a new career adventure. But I've been looking forward all week to talking about this movie because it is just a riot and also very thematically rich. So,
Yeah, I really enjoyed rewatching it today because it's one of those movies that I watched quite a few times the year it came out, and then but somehow wasn't one of those that I've revisited a lot since. And but I knew that I absolutely loved it, and so rewatching it today was a joy. Um, and Yeah, so we'll get into that real quick. I just want to say hi to the people we have in the chat so far. I think Mother Royne might be here, or she might still be running a little late. And, but she's going to be joining us. Also, we've got Danny McKay, and we have Stephanie Frederick. So thank you guys for tuning in tonight.
thank
Um,
you.
it's nice to see that even with doing a movie that's I feel probably a little lesser seen than some of our last couple streams have been. We've been doing Star Wars, X-Men, all that goodness. But I'm glad that we've still got some people tuning in tonight, and yeah. Tonight we are talking about the 2020 film Emma, which of course is an adaptation of Jane Austen's novel. Um, Full disclosure, this is the only version of the story that I have ever seen or experienced. I actually have not read the book, and I haven't seen any of the prior adaptations, but I absolutely adored this movie. Um, it was my favorite movie the year it came out, 2020. Which, as I remarked in on Twitter, or the site formerly known as Twitter, that was the year we were all locked inside.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the fact that I actually, a funny story about how I actually got this movie on Blu-ray was one of the few times that I ordered from Best Buy, uh, which typically I didn't do that. If I ever got anything from Best Buy, I just went directly to the store, or I ordered from Amazon, or something like that. But I remember I had gone the first couple months of the year, or the first fourth of the year, whenever it was, when the lockdown really happened, uh, not ordering movies because I I felt kind of guilty about it, because everybody was ordering all these important necessities from Amazon,
Yeah.
and it was like, am I really going to order a movie and, like, take up the the efforts of the Amazon employees who are taking things, necessities that people need to actually get by during this hard time. So I actually did what I hate to do, which was, for a couple months I actually bought movies digitally. Um, that was listen, everyone, that's the sacrifice I was making. Um, but then at a certain point, after a couple months, I was like, I can't do this. I need I need these new movies that I love on Blu-ray, and this was actually one of the ones that I hadn't seen yet. Um, so I was going to be blind buying it, but I knew I was going to love it because it's obviously right up my alley. So I actually ordered from Best Buy because my train of thought with that was that, well, Best Buy is really only shipping electronics and things that people want, not things that people need. So I felt less guilty about that. So yeah, that's the story of how Emma came to be in my Blu-ray collection, and I, from that first time that I watched it, I just absolutely adored it. It's too bad I didn't get to see this one in the cinemas, but circumstances being what they were, and yeah, no, it feels like a beautiful companion piece in a lot of ways to Pride and Prejudice. Even down to it's a focus features film, and I love starting a movie, having it start with the focus features logo and then the soft sound of birds chirping in the background. It just makes everything feel right and returns me to that feeling of, oh, this is this is a focus features Jane Austen adaptation. And yeah, no, so I absolutely love the movie. So what was your experience getting to see this one?
So, like this I engaged with this movie from a place of relative, like a new perspective, because I loved Pride and Prejudice, and I loved Sense and Sensibility. I will freely admit that I was not as familiar. Apologies, there was a fire truck going by. I told you I live right over the main road. Yes, so I was familiar with, I love the works of Jane Austen, specifically Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. I was, like you, had not actually read Emma before seeing this movie, and neither had I seen the 1996 adaptation. That's probably the most famous adaptation up to this point, starring Gwyneth Paltrow. So this was a new experience for me, and it was also compounded by the fact that I was, as you alluded to, this movie came out in February of 2020, which was about a month before the world shut down and due to the COVID pandemic. And for the longest time, it seemed like, there was a question among certain anxious individuals about whether we would ever get any movies theatrically released ever again. I did not share those sentiments, but I didn't know how long things would last. So for the longest time, it did seem like that we were going to be going through a bit of a drought. And specifically because I do follow the Oscars and those kinds of blogs, the Oscar blogger Twitter sphere was very all in a flutter about the idea that we basically only have movies from mid-March of 2020 for the competition season. So the Best Picture race is going to be a fierce contest between Bad Boys for Life and Emma. And I would have enjoyed that. Ultimately, we did get future movies. But it bears repeating. 2020 was, in many respects, an outlier year for so many reasons that go beyond just the simple human tragedy of the fact that lives were lost, people were sequestered. This was an extraordinary time in our personal history, but it also, for keeping it to the idea of the movies themselves, I think people really started to reevaluate their relationship with movies in that time period because, everyone was in their houses. And one of the ways that people found community was that they engaged with movies, and they engaged, I think it was a time of people actively seeking that kind of connection. And Emma, being a new movie at that time, was one of the points of focus for that. So I also rented it digitally and watched it once it was available, and I really, really did love it. All the more so because, as we'll get into, one of my favorite working actors today is Anya Taylor-Joy. I just think that she is extraordinary as a performer and makes very interesting choices, and I feel like her choice to do this specific movie at this point of her career is a credit to her and will be a stand out in her filmography when we look back at the arc of her career going forward. But
I do have to say, I really do have to say that it is so funny, my experience of seeing her in this, because first I should say this was the first, make special note of this live action performance of hers that I saw, but it was not the first thing I saw with her in it. I also, which I guess is kind of weird, because what I'm about to say is also a technically live action, but hers was a voiceover performance. I saw her in The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, where she played Princess Brea. And she was fantastic and phenomenal in that, but I just knew like her as Brea. And so when I started this movie and she opened her mouth, I was like, oh my God, that voice isn't coming out of a puppet. So it was really weird, but wonderful. I kind of love that this was the first thing that I, saw like a full performance of hers from, because she's so well known for all these like weird, freaky movies. Especially a lot of people knew her first from The Witch, and so the fact that the first thing I knew her from was Dark Crystal, all puppets, and then this, which is a romantic comedy, period drama, all that. It's I kind of love that, because it was probably different from the way a lot of people were first introduced to her. But I have since seen a lot of the other movies, though not all, and it's amazing the range of performances that she can do.
Yeah, I mean, I will own up to the fact that like my first introduction to Anya Taylor-Joy was The Witch, which we did have a discussion of a couple months back, and I love that movie and I love her performance in it. I think it's one of the best film debut performances I've seen by any actress. And I had been keen to see her follow-ups, and she did go on to see a couple other movies that I enjoyed. In particular, I will sing the praises of the movie Thoroughbreds, which, if anyone is interested in a movie starring Anya Taylor-Joy and Olivia Cooke that has elements of murder and revenge and lesbian overtones, that's the movie for you, and it's fun. But
which I feel like this is the right time to make another connection between her and Olivia Cooke as pertains to this movie. If anybody has seen the miniseries from a couple of years ago, an adaptation of what's it? Vanity Fair. Which starred Olivia Cooke, which I just saw like a year ago, I think. And by the way, anybody who who has come to know Olivia Cooke as Allison from House of the Dragon, watch Vanity Fair and you'll get a completely different performance. But the connection there is a couple connections. One is that Johnny Flynn, who plays Mr. Knightley in this, is also in that, and the poor guy does not have an easy time of it in the love department in that movie. He spends almost the entire time pining after someone who's not interested in him. So it was really nice to see him in this, where he gets a unambiguously like happy ending. And also the music is done by the same composers, Isabel Waller-Bridge and I want to say David. Hold on, David Schweitzer. There we go. and I think their music in this is one of the best original scores in years, and they also did the music for Vanity Fair. So this is a roundabout way of saying check out Vanity Fair, because that's actually a really good miniseries. It's on Amazon Prime. So.
Yeah, and check out Thoroughbreds, which is also a movie that, as I mentioned, I think is great, and was a kind of an interesting stepping stone for Anya Taylor-Joy's as well as Olivia Cooke's. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, Isabel Waller-Bridge, who did the music for this movie and did so quite well, she is the older sister of one Phoebe Waller-Bridge, so very talented family. But yeah, the idea for me when I saw that Anya Taylor-Joy was going to be doing this period piece, Emma, like I was familiar that it was one of Jane Austen's, more beloved, works. Unfortunately, given the fact that her life was kind of cut short, she didn't. She only published like I think 7 books, and 3 of them were posthumous. And Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility are kind of generally held up as the most famous of her works. But Emma is beloved as well. And I think because I wasn't as familiar with the story, I was expecting a little bit more of a traditional romantic, period piece. And I was excited to see Anya Taylor-Joy take that on. But the thing that really grabbed me from the moment I saw the first trailer was the fact that this movie is first and foremost a comedy. It is ultimately, it has very sincere emotions and very deep themes, and it is ultimately a movie that takes its subject matter very seriously, and it is a work of art in that way. But it also is first and foremost, and we should not be ashamed to say this, a hilarious comedy of manners. And seeing Anya Taylor-Joy do that from the moment of the trailer, specifically the famous scene where she's eating, something at the picnic and kind of giving someone side eye. Like, you can tell that this is a movie that is going to abide by the traditions of all Regency era England. That's the shot right there. But it also is going to kind of take the piss out of those archetypes, and also in the sense of, conform to the idea that the people who lived in those times may have done a little bit of chafing against that kind of stiffness and formality as well. And this feels very true to life in that respect. So as much as I adore Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility for the fact that they are fully committed to the sweeping, epic, romantic ideals of this time period, I do enjoy, as a contrast, that Emma is a little bit more, irreverent in its approach.
Yeah, no, I was sold on this, the part in the trailer when, with Miss Woodhouse, such news, and then the push open of the window. Oh, great. Yeah, it's funny because at the time, the year before this came out, we also had an adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, which is certainly a different kind of film, but in that sort of same wheelhouse. And I was singing, that movie's praises, and then one of our friends said to me, "Oh, I enjoyed Little Women, but I loved Emma," and of course I hadn't seen it yet. I'd still say I'm not gonna put the 2 films up to compete against each other, but I was really happy for that recommendation because I ended up loving this so much. And actually, both of those movies wound up being my favorite films of their respective years. So yeah, but yeah, what sets this one apart is, as you said, it's a reverent tone. It's not afraid to get, to be a little bit ridiculous and silly and yeah, no, and the cast is just like, I mean, you pretty much know what you're in for as soon as Bill Nighy steps on the screen.
Oh, we are going to have a dedicated section where we talk about just how freaking great Bill Nighy is in this movie. He ultimately got his first Oscar nomination recently for Living. I remember being very retroactively angry that he did not get a supporting actor nomination for this movie, because I just think every scene he is in is outstanding.
It's funny because, like, at this point, just anything that Bill Nighy does is always going to be fantastic. But I sort of love that, and this is a very superficial way. Obviously, there's much more going on, especially like in the last, in a couple of his scenes in the film. But but it does at times feel like the entire performance is Bill Nighy just like doing his famous twitches, and I mean that in the best possible way. Like he does that on a, like, when I say that, I'm thinking about, like, in Love Actually, when but there's a moment when he's sitting there preparing for an interview, and his song starts playing, and he starts doing this, like, and then in, oh God, what's the oh God, what's the film, Hot Fuzz? He plays the chief inspector or something like that, and there's just a moment where he does this funny, like, twitchy smile or whatever. But I just, like, can always identify, like, Bill Nighy doing these really funny, like, little twitches, and this movie just felt like him doing that again and again, like just making commentary on the stuff happening in front of him. And it's just a joy to watch.
Yes, and I admit I did get a chuckle. Wheezy Squeezebach points out Bill Nighy, the science guy. Yes, they do have very similar sounding names, but they are both brilliant men in their respective fields. But Bill Nighy, who I would probably say for genre geeks like many of us are, his most famous role may be as Davy Jones in the Pirates of the Caribbean series, where it gives a brilliant performance, but one that is under several layers of quite transformative CGI. This is a role for him where you can see all of his particular voice patterns and everything that makes Bill Nighy the great consummate performer that he is. But it is also a performance that I love, both because it is pitched very much towards comedy in the early part of the movie, and every single line out of his mouth had me, like, sincerely laughing from my core. But then as the movie goes on, you start to see the layers, and he actually becomes much more of a very sympathetic and tragic figure. And I think that is an outstanding, like, layers to a character who ultimately is not in the movie very much. I do, all kidding aside about the fact that I think he should have gotten a supporting actor nomination for this. I think part of the reason he probably didn't was not only the fact that this movie is a little bit more irreverently pitched, but the fact that he's not in the movie that much. But he's a very important figure.
I will say a couple things here. It's funny you say well known to genre fans as Davy Jones. Although I will say that the thing that I know him best from, and it's something that most people would not think of, because he's, I think as he got older, he had a very distinctive sort of look to him and the sound of his voice. But when he was younger, in the 80s, he was part of the BBC radio dramatization of The Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, he played Samwise.
Yeah.
And he was credited in that at the time as William Nighy. So so there's always a bit of separation for me when I think of him, and it's always weird when I hear him just referred to as Bill. But if anybody hasn't listened to that, it's like, I mean, obviously the films are just beyond compare, but the BBC radio dramatization is just like, as far as like loyalty to the source material, you're not gonna find anything closer, and the performances are just out of this world amazing. And if you're thinking, how on earth could Bill Nighy be Sam Gamgee? He just sounds so completely different from what you expect of him. And Ian Holm actually played Frodo in that adaptation. So I highly recommend that for anybody who's never heard it.
Yeah.
This stream will just be me recommending things that are tangentially connected to the movie.
Well, I mean, and in that spirit, allow me to offer one other recommendation, which is, again, Bill Nighy has had a long and storied career and has played many roles for many decades, and is obviously very famous and very well loved. A movie that I have always adored him in is the 2013 movie About Time by Richard Curtis, starring Donald Gleason and Rachel McAdams, where he plays the main character's father. And it is a fantastic, empathetic, funny, brilliant performance that I adore. And so yeah, that is actually probably my favorite performance of his. All kidding aside about Davy Jones, which was also an outstanding creation. But the reason I bring up About Time specifically is that this movie, his performance in this movie, actually reminds me of that performance, and because it is a performance that is comedically pitched at first, but ultimately reveals larger undercurrents of emotional depth and tragedy, and that pays off in a very emotionally satisfying way. And I do think that for the relationship between his character, Mr. Woodhouse, and Anya, he plays the father of Anya Taylor-Joy's Emma Woodhouse. Their relationship, while it doesn't get a ton of focus in the middle section of the movie, so you can kind of overlook it, it is actually, in many respects, a core idea of the movie. And it is from the beginning, when you see them together and the relationship and how, their interplay, but it really is at the end where you get that gut punch that, makes the entire movie feel a little bit more resonant, and the fact that Emma is so devoted to her father that she doesn't want to leave him because she knows this man would destroy this guy who has already suffered, so much in his life, and that she and Mr. Knightley ultimately agreed to stay and kind of keep him company is funny but sweet, and really gives the movie that kind of the grace note it needs to end on. Because when you think about and we will devote ample time to celebrating all of Bill Nighy's many brilliant lines, but the thing that really sticks with me is the through line is the idea that when they're talking about that scene at the dinner table, where they realize it's going to snow and everyone is racing to get home in their carriages, and it's kind of a funny scene. But Mr. Woodhouse has a line in that movie in that scene where he says, it was snowing when your mother died, and that's not emphasized a lot, but it is made very clear that this is a man who was absolutely unequivocally devastated by the loss of his wife that happened before this movie, and every subsequent loss that he has suffered, even if it is, his elder daughter Isabella going off to get married, or Mrs. Taylor, the governess, going off to get married as well, it breaks him, inside, and he deals with it in a very funny way. But the idea when Emma is telling, my sister was married 7 years ago, surely you've gotten over it by now. He's like, I remember it was a terrible day, and then we get a good laugh at it, but there's a real pain behind that, and it makes it all
that scene really stuck out for me on this viewing. And you're right, it is underplayed, that line, but it's just so, but it feels so gut-wrenching because you're able to read so much. There's still so much traumatic grief there, and it's amazing that that comes across, and just the way he reads the line. That's not, like you said, it's not overdoing it, so it's like it really sells. Oh, this is traumatic. It's just almost blink and you miss it, and it's just a testament to his skill as an actor, that it's simultaneously underplayed but also gut-wrenching.
Yeah, and I love that the movie does that, because it ultimately, it could have overplayed that element. It could have played up the fact that, Emma and her father had lost Emma's mother and Mr. Woodhouse's wife, more, and how that kind of has shaped them. But the movie trusts the audience to get that, and the fact that, Emma is very much a spirited, independent woman who is not interested in marriage because she has independent wealth and power, but she also is very, devoted to her father and doesn't want to leave him. That is something that is established essentially through a few context clues, and then the movie lets it ride. And I always appreciate that level of mature storytelling. I do feel that sometimes movies will, I do think that movies need to be a little bit more overt with that sometimes, because unfortunately sometimes audiences can miss the point. But in this case, there's enough other things going on with the story that you can appreciate it for what it is. And once you actually drill down into this specific aspect, it just makes the movie richer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hate to dive right into the ending, but it really just made you love Mr. Knightley all the more. She's like, you would move in here with me and Papa and give up, your parish, give up your independence, and he doesn't even hesitate. He's like, yes. He just answers yes, yes, yes to everything, and as you would. No, not as everybody would, but he's a great, and I really do think that Johnny Flynn gives one of my favorite male leading performances in this type of movie. I think he's just, you just automatically love the guy, because you can see how much. The first thing we get of him is him walking on foot to their home, and just spending time with both Emma and her father, and so right off the bat, you were told, visually and through context, that this is a guy who absolutely loves these two people. And so from that point on, you're just like, all right, the two of you need to stop butting heads and and just confess your feelings for one another. So it's just a beautiful story.
Yeah. Characters who are willing to walk across the English countryside in order to visit the estates of the women that they love, they have a special place in Jane Austen's oeuvre. Especially if we look at Mr. Darcy and the famous scene that we have gushed about at length, and Elizabeth herself, who is also, as she says, very fond of walking. But I do love, Johnny Flynn, who plays Mr. Knightley, the romantic lead of this movie, although that isn't immediately clear to us based on the way that he's introduced, I really love his performance as well, because it's, again, very underplayed. He is not introduced to us in the same way that other sweeping romantic heroes in this era are, because he and Emma actually have a pre-established relationship. They have known each other basically their entire lives, and there's a line that actually makes it pretty clear as to why they're not head over heels in love with each other already, when they're at the dance scene and Emma is starting to recognize the feelings, but she tells Mr. Knightley, I do not think we are so much brother and sister as to think this is improper. And that kind of really frames the idea that these characters, because they've grown up in such close proximity, even though they know each other so well and are both, young, attractive, marriageable people of the same age, the reason they have not thought of each other in this context before in this way is because they really kind of see each other more in a sibling dynamic until they don't.
Well, also, also his brother is married to her sister. Yeah. So there's that as well.
All these English, when you tie together all these Regency era English family trees, there are a lot of cousins and in-law relationships that would basically make the crisscrossing of those trees, like Charlie's map from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But that's okay. That's the era that they were living in. But in particular, the reason I mentioned that is because their dynamic starts off as the fact that Emma is, as we mentioned, a very intelligent, passionate, independent young woman who is kind of, as the end credits song alludes to, the queen bee of her own little universe. And she delights herself with the idea of arranging these matches between other people, even if she herself does not, think that that's something that she's going to pursue for herself, except as the theoretical concept of one Mr. Frank Churchill, who she seems infatuated with from afar. But Mr. Knightley is introduced as the one character who is kind of able to see Emma for the brilliant but flawed person that she is, and is willing to call her out on it and take the piss out of her a little bit. And while you would think she might bristle about that, she actually seems to enjoy that dynamic, and that makes their scenes together quite fun. And then, of course, the scenes change once they actually start to realize that, the reason that we enjoy interacting with each other in this way is because we actually are very much attracted to each other. But I do appreciate that Johnny Flynn is able to play Mr. Knightley in both contexts, because even though he has that big passionate speech at the end where he's basically like, if I loved you more, less, I might be able to talk about it more. The fact is that, unlike, say, Mr. Darcy, who has that line where he's like, I do not have the luxury, the talent of conversing easily with people I've never met before, Mr. Knightley is able to converse with Emma, and not only he's able to say things to her that, if she were a more, sensitive and took offense easier, might have caused her to push him away, because he calls her on her crap. And I enjoy that dynamic between them, because it, makes their relationship feel more real.
Well, the thing that I love about it is that through their combativeness, there is this feeling that when he finally does deliver the big speech, I forget what the exact wording is, and lovers of the book would crucify me because they know every line. But when he says something to the effect of my dear Emma, am I never to succeed, or something to that effect. There is this implication that, like, even if they haven't, like, consciously, like, been upfront about it, there is this sort of underlying, every time they have a combative argument, the tension there is that, subconsciously, at least, they know of their feelings, and it's kind of like, just when are they going to own up to it and just come out and say it. And I just find that so beautiful, because so beautiful and also incredibly frustrating. Because these two people who clearly care so much for each other, but they have this dynamic where it's we'll be combative, but we're never going to admit what's actually going on underneath the surface. And and the moment when I hate to jump to this already, but the moment when they really do start to realize it is at the ball. And oh my God, Jane Austen movies and dance scenes, right? Because even though I'd seen the movie already, a couple times, I was watching this today and I was holding my breath during that sequence, and just so beautiful and so full of, like, just tension and and bottled up feelings, and it's I love when scenes like that happen and then they end and then I exhale without realizing that I've been holding my breath. And that is just so beautifully done.
Yeah, I love a good ball scene, especially in the Jane Austen adaptation. Nothing is ever touching the dance scene from Pride and Prejudice. That's like an all-time cinematic moment for me. But this one's pretty damn good, and it ultimately is, as you said, the moment when the feelings that these two characters have for each other are truly coming out into the open, because they've been percolating throughout the movie, but I do feel that Emma is probably a little bit more unaware of them. I do think Mr. Knightley was actually more aware of the fact that he had romantic feelings for Emma in this way, but one of the elements of his performance and their dynamic that I really love is the idea that he sees Emma for who she is. He sees the spark of intelligence. He sees her beauty. He sees that she is, someone who has a caring heart ultimately and means well, even if she ultimately doesn't express it in the best ways at times. But the big thing is that he also sees her flaws. He sees her need to kind of be kind of above people and manipulate them in the ways that, like, create these little matches and games that she finds amusing, but then can credit herself as having arranged them. And he has that line where he tells her, like, as handsome as you are, I don't think you're personally vain in that way. I think your vanity lies elsewhere. And that is exactly right. Her vanity is much more in the idea that she is this benevolent do-gooder who is kind of floating, like, above it all. And I think in many respects, what Mr. Knightley is trying to do throughout the movie is he sees the woman, Emma, for who she is, and he loves her for it. But he also, and not in a malicious kind of way, but like in a very caring and generous way, he wants her to be better. He wants her to follow her better instincts that she knows she has. And anytime she does something, particularly her machinations surrounding Harriet, that he thinks are kind of off pace, he's basically like, why did you do that? Like that was mean. That was unkind. That was beneath you. And it could come across as condescending, but the way that Mr. Knightley and Johnny Flynn plays it, it doesn't, because you know that he's right. You know, Emma is ultimately playing games with these people's lives. And ultimately, not to jump into this scene because it's one of the most important scenes in the movie, but it comes to a head when she makes the cruel comment to Mrs. Bates. And that's when Mr. Knightley makes absolutely no illusions that what you did there was cruel and unfeeling and wrong, and I will not stand by and let you like live in delusion about that. And that's the moment that really breaks through to Emma. And from there, she becomes a different character.
I think one of my favorite parts about that sequence is that it's not like you know, Emma doesn't realize what she's done is, you know, absolutely horrific. The moment it comes out of her mouth, like she realizes that she's done something monstrous, and the sort of, you know, pain and awkwardness on her face, and you know, it's such a wonderful moment of performance by Anya Taylor-Joy, and the fact that she kind of tries to brush it off, and but then of course Mr. Knightley is having none of that. He's calling her out on it right there, and it's one of the most like just heartbreaking moments in the movie, and just the way, because you can tell that, because everything that he's saying comes from a place of love. It's like, you know, he's not, you know, he's not saying those things to be, you know, sort of mean to her, but it's like, but he loves her, and but like he's like, you understand, right? What you just did was terribly, horribly, you know, cruel, and it's the sort of moment of, you know, someone who loved you dearly but needs to take you to task for something you've done, which is horrible, so that you recognize what you've done is that bad. And it's just like as if the actual moment wasn't heartbreaking enough, but just that exchange between the two of them is just it's gut wrenching, because he's hurt seeing something like that come from her, because he wants her to be better than that. And yeah, it's, but like, yeah, talking about performances, like just amazing performances, you know, the character of Miss Bates, played by Miranda Hart, her reaction to that moment is just,
Yeah.
And this is a character which, you know, it's one of those things where audience participation, you know, bites you in the behind, because it's like all throughout the movie you have been kind of, you've been laughing at her, you know, through Emma's eyes, because Emma finds her utterly ridiculous, and you know, she is a, you know, she can be a silly character, but then the moment that happens and you realize just how horrific it is, like everything about that dynamic shifts in that moment. And it's just the fact that she's so eager to, you know, Miss Bates is just so eager to cast the most positive light on it, that she can't, even though you can see how heartbroken she is. She's like, oh, Miss Woodhouse must have had a reason for saying, it's just, it's so utterly heartbreaking.
Yeah, the actress who plays Mrs. Bates, Miranda Hart, I had really only seen her in one thing before this, the 2015 comedy film Spy, where she was hilarious, and I enjoyed her performance very much, but it hadn't given me the sense that, you know, of what she could do with a role like this, because as you say, like, the character of Mrs. Bates in this movie is pitched exactly as, Emma often, would characterize her. She is coded to be to the audience as well as Emma as annoying in many respects. Because she is so overeager, she's so willing to share details of her personal life that are perhaps not as much of interest to other people as she thinks they may be, like particularly her devotion to her niece, Jane Fairfax. But it's ultimately at the core, kind of like what we mentioned with with Bill Nighy as Mr. Woodhouse in performance. It's an underplayed element that the reason she is the way that she is because she is very lonely and has, as Mr. Knightley points out, has fallen from her station. As there's the exchange where Emma says, quote, "You must allow what is good and most ridiculous or most unfortunately blended in her." And Mr. Knightley responds, "They are blended in her, I acknowledge, and were she a woman of fortune, I would not quarrel with you for any liberties of manner. But she is poor. She is sunk from the comfort she was born to, and if she lived to an old age, she would probably sink more." And that is a tragic circumstance because you can see that at the core of this, idea that Mrs. Bates' adoration of Emma is very sincere. She looks up to her as a beautiful and accomplished, woman, even though she's many years her junior. And her desire to constantly share this news with her is kind of an awkward attempt to, have that connection and to be close to her because she looks up to her so. And it's so unbelievably heartbreaking that not only the moment when Emma makes that comment that why stop at 3? You've never stopped being that dull. It's devastating in the moment, and every actor plays it that way. But honestly, what's as equally devastating to me is when Emma goes to apologize and Mrs. Bates forgives her immediately, because it's the idea that, that was an incredibly hurtful comment, and it was something that she would be well within her rights to think less of Emma for, but she doesn't. And she is so willing to just take that forgiveness the moment it's offered. And it just makes your heart crack, and you just develop such a depth of empathy for this woman who is probably the 7th or 8th most prominent character in this movie. It's really, really well done.
Yeah, I will say I misremembered that scene actually, because when I went to watch the film today, for some reason I had remembered that there was more of a forthright confrontation between the two of them in that moment. But the fact that she just, Miss Bates, is just completely forgiving towards Emma and is basically, just, just acting, outwardly almost like nothing had happened. It's so heartbreaking, and so, like you just weep for this woman who, and yeah, it's such a gut-wrenching moment in the movie, and but it's but Emma needed to see the hurt that that she caused, and I think that's even more evident by what Miss Bates, the fact that she doesn't take Emma to task, I think speaks even more loudly.
Yeah, and I mean, because that's just the kind of character that she is. Some might say she is not standing up for herself enough, but we have empathy for her for that because this is her station in life, and she is and this is her nature, and she's not going to hold a grudge just because it's it's expedient or because she was genuinely hurt. She still loves Emma, and the fact that she forgives her so quickly is a testament to that, and it's a further catalyst for Emma's change, in addition to the idea that, like, as we alluded to, she's already started to develop this connection with Mr. Knightley. It's important, the fact that they develop this connection, and then Mr. Knightley calls her out on this after they've started to have these romantic feelings for each other, because it's clear that he loves her now, but he's still willing to say, what you did here was wrong and beneath you and cruel, and I'm not going to be with you if that's the way you're going to be. And because Emma, frankly, is learning the cost of some of the games that she's playing, that's one of the reasons that she ultimately does start to make amends by the end and becomes a better person for it.
Yeah. Important to note that, this whole confrontation comes after Emma has started to make googly eyes at Mr. Knightley, as we mentioned earlier, which is this scene. I just to be inside his head in that moment. But it's it's the emotional catalyst for everything that happens after that, because once we're going to pause for the mid-roll in a minute, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about Harriet, because I don't want to jump right to the end of her story without talking a bit about her character first. But but I will say it's a testament to Anya Taylor-Joy's performance of Emma, that, like, obviously we're waiting for her to have this sort of realization of, the fact that she has been quite cruel in several respects. And again, I don't really have anything to compare it to, because I haven't read the book. I haven't seen the other film adaptations, but I imagine Emma Woodhouse can be quite a difficult character to bear in this story, depending on the adaptation. And what Anya Taylor-Joy does with this character is just like, she makes you love her even as you're sort of cringing at at the things that she's doing, which I think is critical for this story, because you can't. It would be very easy to to have a dislike of Emma, or to even hate her, but it's this beautiful balance where she's does and says things that are just completely improper and and horrible in a lot of ways, but we kind of still but Anya just, she sort of radiates off the screen with that kind of magic of her performance that makes you love her even as she's doing stuff that are horrible, and then you want to see her sort of see the error of her ways and come out better on the other side.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a unique and actually kind of brilliant feature of a lot of Jane Austen's works, that there's rarely like a true villain of the piece, like an external force who is creating all this malevolent influence and is the one that our heroes, or usually heroine in Jane Austen's case, needs to overcome. A lot of times the central conflict is driven in many respects by either social, structures and niceties, or by the prejudices and kind of flaws of the central characters. And that's particularly true with this movie, Emma, because in many respects, even though Emma herself is the titular role, to borrow from Lady Bird there. Emma is kind of in a lot of ways the main villain of the piece for a lot of the movie, because she is, a lot of the misfortune and conflict that are unfold throughout the course of the movie is ultimately her fault. It is her, due to her machinations and keeping, for instance, Harriet separated from her love, the farmer Robert Barton, and her kind of machinations in trying to arrange matchmaking for other characters and for herself with Frank Churchill. And the thing is that, like, she ultimately is not a villainous character, but she is ultimately the central conflict comes from her, because she has a certain vanity, as Mr. Knightley tells her, that needs to be overcome for this story to be resolved. And it's a testament to Anya Taylor-Joy's performance that she can be, in many respects, our protagonist and the hero of the story, and its villain and the antagonist, and they can synthesize that in one character and bring it to a satisfying resolution, which is a testament again to Jane Austen's story, but also to the fact to Anya Taylor-Joy's performance. Because if the audience ever reached a point with her performance where basically like, she sucks, I'm done with her, then the movie wouldn't work. And at least for me, we never get there. Again, I have such incredible goodwill towards Anya Taylor-Joy because I love her as an actress. But I think even for someone who might not be as familiar with his work, she displays enough charm and wit and empathy that you are still rooting for her to make that better choice by the end, which she does.
Yeah, I will say, if you want to, going back to, again, my recommendation earlier of Vanity Fair, you want to really struggle with a main character, again, Olivia Cooke's performance in that, she makes you, come to the brink of loathing her character. but yeah, no, Emma is, it's funny because in some respects she is almost an antagonist at times, but I will say that there is a character that comes off worse.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, but the reason I don't consider him the primary antagonist is because he's ultimately so ineffectual. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like loathing a character, yeah, Mr. Elton is pretty far down the totem pole. He is a true Mr. Collins in every sense of the word.
Yeah, let's pause on that and go ahead and do the mid-roll real quick. So a little bit of a change in, not too much of a change in the actual order of things we're going to be doing, but we're actually going to be taking next week off because I realized that next Sunday is Father's Day. So, instead of spending the whole day prepping for a stream, maybe I'll spend some time with my dad. So we're going to take next Sunday off. And when we come back the Sunday after that, we'll be picking up with Star Wars, and we'll be doing our coverage of Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, which is going to be great because we talked a lot about Episode 2 last week, and how at the time that it came out, I kind of struggled with some elements of it, and it wasn't. I didn't have the positive response to it that I did to the Phantom Menace, back when I was on my own island of fandom without the internet and all that. With Episode 3, I'm not going to say that there still weren't some issues that I had on certain areas, but I unabashedly adored the movie. So that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. And and then after that, we have some things that are kind of floating around. We might switch up the order on some stuff, but I think tentatively we're going to be. I think we're thinking about Black Swan after that, dependent on on guests that we're trying to invite on. So yeah, and then at some point down the line, we're going to be covering The Acolyte. Jared, you and I talked about that. We might wait until the end because my feeling on that is that there's so much speculation going on right now about, twists and, and turns and like characters and, sort of speculation about the mystery of the show. And I feel like I kind of want to leave, all that until once, I'm done with the show. So, but who knows? Maybe we'll get halfway through this season and I'll be like, screw it. We need to talk about it. But yeah, so that'll be coming up at some point. Yeah. I don't know, anything you want to mention while we're doing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think it's a good idea for us to take the next weekend off to celebrate Father's Day. I'll be spending some time with my dad and my mom, which I'm very much looking forward to. But I am very excited to talk about Revenge of the Sith because, as a prequel kid and as someone who, adores all of those movies and adores all of Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith is a special one. I think it is, in terms of like overall story, like the epic, mythic, tragic nature of it, I actually think it might have the best story of any Star Wars movie. And I'm really looking forward to delving into that. We'll have to be careful that the stream doesn't go too long because that is one where we're going to have to, behave ourselves and make sure we don't get carried away. But there is so much to talk about there. Revenge of the Sith, for me, it's like I fluctuate as to what my favorite Star Wars movie is. I usually have a top three of Empire Strikes Back, Rise of Skywalker, and Revenge of the Sith in some order. It kind of depends on what I've seen most recently. And Revenge of the Sith has a strong claim because there's just so much there that I think is absolutely brilliant, even if there are some elements that are of execution that aren't quite there. But I think that the good so infinitely outstrips them that I just adore it. It is one of my it's in my top 10 favorite movies ever, and it's very secure in that position.
I remember my feeling watching it on opening night at the theater where, and I still had some of my, I guess we want to call them complaints, of, episode 2, about like some of the moments of performance, writing, what have you. But my experience that night was one of like, there was such overwhelming power to the story and the flow of the story and like just the feelings that I was getting that they sort of superseded any of those issues that I had. So it was just such an incredibly powerful experience. And yeah, I just, and the only question I have about this stream, will be, do I go ahead and fit in a viewing of the Siege of Mandalore to go with it? But then if that were part of the conversation too, we'd definitely be going on for like 5 or 6 hours.
Oh, I think if we ever want to talk about the Siege of Mandalore, we probably need to make that its own discussion, which we definitely could. There's more than enough there, but it's, it is it is ultimate. It is, I think, the pivotal chapter of the Skywalker saga, and I just think that the power of the story that George Lucas crafted has only grown even more resonant for me after 20 years basically of sitting with the movie. And again, one of the most important movies of my life. I'm looking forward to delving into it. We're also going, at least on my end, I'm going to be talking a lot about the novelization of it, the novelization of Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover, because that is, canon or legends, my all-time favorite Star Wars book, and it has informed and shaped my love for the story as well. but yeah, it's so it'll be great to delve into that, and we've got a couple other good stuff planned, as you alluded to. Order to be determined, but we want to talk about Black Swan. We want to revisit our before trilogy viewings with Before Sunset. We're going to continue our revisited series with discussion of Blade Runner 2049. We're going to get back to Keira Knightley, probably with Anna Karenina at some point, and then, as you mentioned, Logan, with the X-Men and the Acolyte. So a lot of great stuff coming up, but we'll take a little bit of a hiatus for over next week for Father's Day and then get back to it, but definitely starting with Revenge of the Sith.
And who knows, with an extra week, maybe I'll plow through that Revenge of the Sith novelization.
I can't recommend it highly enough.
Thing is, though, here's the thing, though. Like, I feel like before I do that, I want to read Shatterpoint first, just given that they're both, written by Matthew Stover, and from what I understand, some stuff from Shatterpoint kind of feeds into the Revenge of the Sith novelization. So I don't know. We'll see. If I don't get to it, you'll have one over on me.
Yeah, and if you don't, that's fine. But just know that I will be quoting from it liberally, because there are some passages in there that are actually like some of my favorite pieces of writing that I've ever encountered. So
yeah. So we got a lot of stuff coming up. It's just the exact order we're gonna have to figure out. But yeah. And we are trying to maneuver a couple guests into coming on for our Black Swan discussion in particular. So yeah. So let's go ahead and dive back in to talking about Emma, and let's go ahead and talk about the character of Harriet Smith, played by Mia Goth, who, from what I understand, is known for a lot of other stuff that I haven't seen. And a lot of it looks very freaky.
Yeah. No, she has cultivated a reputation in recent years as something of what they call a screen queen, both before and after this movie. As you said, that's not my typical preferred genre of movie, but so I haven't seen a lot of those films like Pearl or X or Suspiria, but I know that they are considered very well regarded, and I know that she is a very talented actress, and I think her performance in this movie is great. Again, as a character who, in some respects, you have a lot of compassion for, but also, she is pitched as a character who could rub on your nerves the wrong way in certain respects, because she is so enraptured by Emma and so willing to follow her every lead that sometimes it's natural for the audience to get frustrated with her when she allows Emma to lead her astray. But that's part of the design of the character, and I think Mia Goth plays that very well.
Yeah, I just felt so sorry for her. Just because, especially, so let's sort of set the stage. Emma, takes her on as, let's not be delicate about it, as a project, basically. As someone who's, is, isn't, fortunate, shall we say, to, live on the, on the side of life that Emma gets to. And there's her circumstances are kind of unknown with her parentage and stuff. And so she kind of takes her on just to, it's very self-serving to be she's like, I can improve anybody's station. And, it's just, yeah. And so and she's very much in love with this character of Robert Martin, who's, but Emma, looks down on him, and she's looking to, fix Harriet up with someone very well off, and so she very sort of subtly, manipulates Harriet into refusing, the offer of marriage, and from that point, I'm just like, oh, this poor girl, and and she just dotes on, Emma so much, that everything she does, she just hangs on her word, and it's just so difficult to watch someone who, clearly thinks so highly of Emma, just, being manipulated so much throughout the movie. You know, but then there's a moment where Emma kind of betrays, the truth, where, she says to, Mr. Knightley, I just want to keep her for myself,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's yeah. So I don't know. Some people might not, might struggle with the character, but I just thought she was great. Just, her big flaw is that, she, she can't see the ways in which she's being manipulated by Emma, although she eventually does. And it
Yeah,
is nice to see her stand up for herself, later in the film.
yeah, I mean, like in some of the other characters refer to her as silly or simple, and I don't really think that that is fair, even though she does act that way in sometimes. I think, we have to understand both the circumstances of her birth and her position in the society. She is a young woman who was born clearly out of wedlock. And her father, as we later learn, is not actually a gentleman, which is part of Emma's fascination with her, that like, oh, she must be like of, noble heritage because she's been provided for. But actually her father's a tradesman, and he's just trying to make sure she's looked after until it's socially acceptable for him to claim his role as her father. But in this era, basically, children who are born out of wedlock, bastards, as Game of Thrones would term them, they really don't have much in the way of social standing, unless someone like Emma, who is a very noble stock and very wealthy and independent, takes an interest in them, and that's part of why Harriet ends up being so devoted to her, because it's the idea that, she's being provided, she goes to school, she's not like, destitute, but the idea that Emma Woodhouse, this incredibly powerful, rich, beautiful, intelligent, compelling heiress, could take an interest in me, little old me, that's just the greatest thing that's ever happened in Harriet's life. And so, of course, she's going to hang on every word and want to, have that connection and that affiliation with Emma. And for the most part, like, as you said, Emma kind of takes her on as a little bit of a charity case and an object of mystery in the beginning, because that's the kind of thing about her amusement. Ultimately, she does end up having a very real affection for her. It's just important to acknowledge that where it comes from, the idea that when she relays to Mr. Knightley her kind of disregard for the man that Harriet's in love with, Robert Martin, she says, quote, "The Martins are precisely the order of people with whom I feel I can have nothing to do. A degree or two lower might interest me. If they were very poor, I might hope to be useful to them in some way. But a farmer can need none of my help and is therefore as much above my notice as he is below it." That is such a feeling quote, and not one that does Emma credit. Obviously, it is something she overcomes by the end of the movie, but yeah, it becomes clear by the very fact that she says that there are characters who fall above that line, like Mr. Knightley, who is of similar social status, and Mr. Churchill, who she is fascinated with from afar. And then there are the characters who are below that line, who she has a charitable interest in, and unfortunately Harriet falls there. Now, that's probably not fair to Harriet, but it is the reason that Emma takes an interest in her, and ultimately the reason that she ultimately meddles in Harriet's life to the extent that probably does Harriet more harm than good. And frankly, Emma is lucky that Harriet doesn't hold it against her more than she does when she finds out the extent of those machinations. Because from the moment you see Harriet with Robert Martin, who is played by an actor, Connor Swindells, who honestly, I can't even remember how much dialogue he has in the movie. It's only a couple of lines. But the moment you see these two together, it is clear that they are madly in love with each other. And that is a great performance.
So this is just the face of a guy you feel sorry for because he's been rejected. Like, you're right, he may not even... I think he only has like a couple lines, maybe in the scene where he's with Mr. Knightley. And maybe a word or two elsewhere. The rest of the time, the poor guy just ends up looking really sad, and you immediately feel sorry for him. Like, and it's true what you say. Like, if Emma hadn't like got involved in Harriet's life, Robert Martin, almost certainly still would have proposed, and Harriet would have said yes, and and she would have wound up in the same position with regard to him as she does at the end of the film. So in that respect, like, Emma was just one big stumbling block. We'll call that.
Yeah, and that's part of the tragedy of it, because Harriet is not a social climber. She would have. There are characters in Jane Austen's work who come from poorer backgrounds, but who are very much like, I need to marry rich, and I will do whatever the hell I have to do in order to make that happen. We just saw that with Sense and Sensibility when we talked about that a few months ago. Harriet's not that. She is clearly enraptured with Robert Martin. She would have said yes immediately to him if she didn't feel the need to seek Emma's opinion first. And some of the travails that she goes through of, turning her affections toward Mr. Elton and ultimately Mr. Knightley would not have happened were it not for Emma's influence. And, some of that is on her because, she allows herself to be led. And unfortunately, as Mr. Knightley says, like, she really couldn't expect better, given her social standing, which is an unfortunate reality of the time, because ultimately she is not the gentleman's daughter. She is the daughter of a tradesman.
But I do like that we also see some growth on Knightley's part with regard to that, because he's sort of very dismissive of what she could expect. And then later in the movie you get, where he says that, Emma's match between Harriet and Elton would have been, a step up for Elton, just because he holds, by that point he holds Harriet in high esteem, which he doesn't, I think, earlier on. So it was nice to see that he goes through a bit of growth there as well.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that for his character. It's a credit to him that he recognizes that in Harriet's character. And to be honest, like, if Harriet had been able to marry up, like, she would have been, deserving of that opportunity. It's not such a great disparating match as even, like, honestly, like the idea in Pride and Prejudice, the social disparity between someone like, Mr. Darcy, who is the wealthiest of the wealthy, and Elizabeth Bennet, who is a gentlewoman but impoverished, like, it's not that much bigger of a gap. It could have been reasonable, even the fact that Harriet is like a child who was born out of wedlock. But ultimately, the reason that it ends up being so, tragic is because it's, as we say, Harriet ultimately ends up back, accepting Mr. Martin's offer of marriage anyway, quite happily, because she was always in love with him. And everything that she goes through in refusing him initially, and then, going through suffering of pining after men who aren't interested in her, like the loathsome Mr. Elton and the genteel Mr. Knightley, is part of Emma's designs. And in particular, it's compounded by the fact that it's not just the fact that she loves Robert Martin, it's the fact that she has a close connection with his family and has been kind to them. Honestly, one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire movie for me is when she encounters not just Mr. Martin in the flower shop, but his sisters, Catherine and I think it's Isabel, maybe. And they're just basically, they know that she broke their brother's heart, but they're basically just like, we haven't seen you around. We miss you. When are you coming back to see us? And you're just like, oh God.
It's basically, in terms of the reaction you get, it's the complete opposite of a similar scene that you get with Mrs. Bennet.
Yeah.
And Mr. Bingley, like, you promised to come visit us. That's like, oh God. And whereas this is like your heart goes out to them, and all these, this poor family. They love Harriet so much. It's oh God. Yeah, that scene just breaks my heart. And the way she then just meekly says, Mr. Martin, and ducks out of there as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and then he follows her, and then he wants to obviously pour his heart out to her, but then he's basically like, take the high road by the barn. The road down that you're going down is flooded. And she's like, thank you. And then you're just basically like, God, just talk to each other. Just pour your hearts out to each other. But they can't, because this is Regency area England and everything needs to be done properly, and because Emma, unfortunately, has, to a certain extent, poisoned the well. And it's a mistake that she has to undo before ultimately Harriet can accept Mr. Martin's proposal, and they can be happy together. And it's why it's so important in that final, once Emma and Mr. Knightley are recognizing their feelings for each other, and Mr. Knightley, who is clearly thinks very highly of his tenant farmer, Mr. Martin, and has constantly been talking him up, is like, I'll go fix this. And Emma's like, no, I must go. I must fix this. And
which, by the way, and a note about that scene, though, which makes it great, is the fact that Anya Taylor-Joy can make her nose bleed on cue, apparently, which just adds a hilarity to that scene, as you're getting all these emotions pouring out, and her nose starts to bleed, and he's like, Emma.
Yeah.
And no. Great, but let's jump back a bit to talk about the Emma's first disastrous attempt at a match with Harriet, which is this fucker here. Sorry for the language, everybody. Like, the fact that it so cracked me up, the fact that that Josh O'Connor, who plays Mr. Elton, when I found out that he was cast as Charles in The Crown, I was like, oh, of course he is. And the fact that I actually liked his Charles a lot more than I like Mr. Elton just shows how deplorable Mr. Elton is. Oh God! Yeah. But it's so like I love right off the bat the hilarity that ensues, where he's like, we gathered together at this time of man's great innocence. and then and then Mr. Woodhouse goes, innocence? Innocence. No?
Which is the line that opened the first trailer and really kind of set the tone for the entire movie. And it's one of Bill Nighy's best scenes reacting to that. And it is just what's not its words. It's fucking hilarious. That's innocence. Innocence? Innocence? No? I just think it's hysterical. And the thing is, it's so emblematic of his character because this guy is such a simpering doofus in every scene that you encounter him from subsequently. Like, that would have been just like, you know, a funny comedic beat. But then you realize, no, that is actually who this guy is. And like the way he kind of presents himself and comports himself, even though he is supposed to be respectable as a member of the clergy, you know, in this area, he is probably the closest thing, as you said, to in this movie that we have to a truly loathsome character, matched only perhaps by the woman he ultimately takes as his wife, Augusta, who is they are well matched in that way, and perhaps no other way, because dear God, I wouldn't want to spend a second in the company of these people. But
okay, sorry, just look at his face. I want to smack him. I really do. And that's a great testament to Josh O'Connor. He's a brilliant actor, and like I joke about, you know, him playing Charles in The Crown, and whatever your feelings about, you know, King Charles. Oh God, King Charles, the actual man. Like, especially in I think season 3, Josh O'Connor did a great job of humanizing the character, and like the fact that I actually saw him as like a real human being, you know, who, you know, had, you know, all these dimensions to him, you know, it was a big step up from this movie because he is loathsome, utterly loathsome in this.
Yeah. No, he has, and I say this again as a credit to Josh O'Connor as a performer. He has one of the most inauthentic smiles in this movie that I've ever seen in my entire, like the way it stretches to its ears, but you can tell it's just purely a performative act. And just the little, like, the mincing quality to his mannerisms and affectations. It's really, like, it makes your skin crawl as it should. And as we alluded to earlier, the reason that he is ultimately not considered like the true villain of this movie is because you never get the sense that even if he's pining after Emma and trying to entice her into marriage, you never get the sense that she's in any like danger from this guy. Like, she is more than capable of handling this fop, and the only reason that he even finds himself in that position is that she is so blind and thinking that she's doing a good thing by matching him up with Harriet, that she allows him to get so close, and then she realizes, oh shit. And then that scene in the carriage when she, you know, very firmly puts him down, like, that is a credit to her. It does, you know, speak, you know, to the credit of, you know, Anya Taylor-Joy's performance, the fact that she does so forcefully and he accepts it, like, you do actually feel kind of bad for him in that moment when he basically, like, demands the carriage be stopped and gets out, because Emma makes no illusions that basically, like, I would never in a million years be interested in a person like you. And no matter how loathsome you are, that's going to hurt. So I do think
that's actually a brilliant bit of performance by Josh O'Connor, because I, like, throughout that scene, I go back and forth constantly between, you know, having utter contempt for him and then also, oh, but I do feel a little sad. The contempt is strongest when he screams at the top of his lungs and bangs on the carriage to stop, because that's bordering on, like, being sort of physically oppressive, even threatening violence. and that for me is where he tips into like villain, and I'm like, oh no, you better just get the hell out of there. But then he does this thing when he gets out of the carriage, and you can see how dejected he is, and so yeah, he's just very pathetic.
Yeah,
He really is, and he demonstrates that light throughout the rest of the film, but you're right, but any pretense about him being a villain of the piece is sort of deflated by the fact that like he doesn't do anything afterwards that's of any real threat to anything. So he's just as sad, a sad, pathetic character, and what a great performance, as such.
Yeah, and I don't want to underscore the fact that he is not just like a pathetic character, but he is even as a man of God and a respectable man, he is cruel in many respects.
Yeah.
The comments he makes about Harriet are horrible. Like the line when when Emma has painted her and she thinks she's doing Harriet a favor, when he tells Emma, you have given Miss Smith all she requires. She was a beautiful creature when she came to you, but the attractions you have added are infinitely superior to what she has received from nature. Ugh, God, that just makes your skin crawl when he says that. And the idea
and then of course, like later on, then when he refuses to to ask her to dance, which, to be honest, Harriet's better off.
Oh yeah.
But it is still a very cruel gesture, and which makes Mr. Knightley's gesture of coming over and asking her to dance like even better, which you can forgive Harriet for thinking that he's God's gift in that moment, and falling for him a little bit. So
yeah, and he gets his comeuppance in the sense that he is so hurt and dejected by Emma's refusal that he could have just sat with that and processed it, but kind of like Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, he immediately goes and runs off and gets himself married off to the first woman who will have him, who in Mr. Collins actually manages to find a nice woman in Charlotte who is a credit to him. But Mr. Elton goes off and finds his rather loathsome partner, Augusta, who is honestly every bit as bad, if not worse, in the way that she treats everyone around her. And you get the sense immediately that this, Mr. Elton's going to be miserable with her. And that's the fate he chose for himself, because he is so, vain, and his pride is so strong that it essentially dooms him to a life of unhappiness. But I do actually, in a weird way, it is notable that he actually is in the final scene where he marries Emma and Mr. Knightley. And I actually do find it interesting that they have him in that scene, and he gives the speech, and he says, in a sense, correctly, and he doesn't seem to be like a jackass about it. So you're like, maybe he's learning, maybe, but it's a long road for this guy.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, so maybe the movie's ending on this thought of that there aren't going to be any hard feelings moving forward, and then, and then I'm like, oh, it's better than me. I'm holding on to my anger at the schmuck. But no, and it's funny because it kind of builds up to that reveal of him standing there. You're like, is he doing the wedding, or did they get somebody else to do it? And the fact that then it's revealed that it is him, and it's an interesting, and that's an interesting touch. yeah, it's I yeah, maybe it hints at some growth there. It'd be interesting if when someday I get around to reading the book, if it's got a bit more about, the direction his character kind of goes in by the end. Um, but side note, I will say that, speaking of like reading the book and finding out where, the direction certain characters go on, I actually, when I read Pride and Prejudice, I actually had a worse impression of Collins in the book versus the movie. Especially, he has this speech to Elizabeth, I think, and near the end of the book, and I was like, "Oh, you jackass!"
Yeah.
So I think he actually comes off a bit better in the film.
Yeah, and I think that speech actually is in the 1995 BBC version where he's played by David Bamber, and he's yeah, I actually find that version of him more loathsome than the 2005 version. Where he's a little bit more of a joke, but it's noticeable that Jane Austen has this type of character recurring throughout her works. This kind of foppish clergyman who is trying to pursue the heroine and romantically, and is not living up to the values that they should as a person of the cloth. So
yeah, when we get around to talking about the 95 Pride and Prejudice, I will have things to say about that version of Mr. Collins, because I actually really like David Bamber as an actor a lot. Those of you who have seen Rome, he played Cicero in that, and he was utterly fantastic. He is deplorable as Collins in the 95 Pride and Prejudice. Oh God, yeah. He's the worst. Oh, but yeah.
But Josh O'Connor again, great performance.
And he seems like a very nice guy, even though
yeah, and I know, like, for instance, he's like, now I think he's in that new movie Challengers with Zendaya and Mike Feist, and he's basically become a heartthrob in that movie. And it's a credit to him that he can play that range, because in this movie he is the very opposite of all of
that. And then we have somebody else who comes onto the scene, and that is Mr. Frank Churchill, who, like, I'm kind of undecided on how I feel about him as a character, because I'm interested to get your take on it, because I feel like maybe I'd have a clearer, I'd have a firmer opinion on him if I had read the book, and I'll look forward to that one day, because maybe there's a bit more. But I kind of feel like he does some definitely underhanded things, but I also feel like if this story was written from his point of view, it would be sympathetic to, to both his position and Jane's as well. Not that the film isn't sympathetic to Jane, it very much is, but yeah, I was interested to get your opinion on him.
Well, I'm of two minds about Mr. Frank Churchill. I do think he is meant to be presented to us as not the most agreeable character. He is very much as Nighy, who has nothing but contempt for the guy for most of the movie, a trifling, silly fop. We learn early in the movie that he is like blown off coming to his father's wedding because he doesn't really think the woman that his father is marrying is worthy of that station, and how dare he disrespect Gemma Whelan like that. Yara Greyjoy would never stand for it. And the idea that he is very much, kind of presenting himself above it all. And he had like taken the name of his rich aunt because he is going to be her inheritance. And so he presents himself in a way that is not meant to be sympathetic. And Emma's infatuation with him from afar is not really a credit to her. To her credit, once she meets him, you start to see that infatuation fade a little bit because she kind of recognized what he is. I do think, though, that even though he is, you know, a fop and kind of arrogant and makes some cruel comments, he ultimately, you do see the sympathetic heart of his plight because they make it clear that he actually is very much in love with this woman, Jane Fairfax, who his rich aunt disapproves of and would disinherit him if he were to marry her. So let's call it like it is. He's basically waiting for his aunt to die so that he can marry the woman he truly loves, and that as very evocative of, you know, Sense and Sensibility, which we had just talked about. You know, again, these elements recur throughout Jane Austen's works, and in that respect, you're actually, you know, that's a credit to him. He's like, I know this woman is beneath my social station. I don't care. I love her anyway. I want to marry her, and I will do whatever I have to do to make that happen. And I will, in the meantime, I will make sure that she is not ruined by her association with me. So the fact that they are in, you know, they're constantly in their same orbit, but they're like, oh, I'm barely acquainted with that person. It's, you know, it makes it, you know, they're putting on a performance, but it's clearly wearing on them both. And we see that more from Jane's side when she confesses to, you know, to Emma that she basically like, do you ever get like, we all know what it is at times to be wearied in spirits. Mine, I confess, are exhausted. She just can't take it anymore because she wants to be with the man that she loves, and he can't, you know, openly be with her at this point. Mr. Churchill puts on a little bit of a better performance, and again, it is a credit to him that ultimately he wants to be with this woman who clearly is below his social station and is willing to wait for her. But that doesn't mean that he comes across as agreeable to us, because he isn't. You know, he is very much a, you know, someone can contain multitudes. They can have a very sincere affection for, you know, somebody who loved them truly, and also treat others cruelly. And Mr. Churchill does. Like, he is unfortunately the one who kind of eggs Emma on into making the cruel comment at the picnic towards Mrs. Bates, just because he's bored. So not the greatest guy, but one who actually does have a core of humanity to him. And I do think Callum Turner, who plays him, who I had primarily seen in the Fantastic Beasts movies, where he played Theseus Scamander, it's a good performance, even if he doesn't get a ton of range to play.
I was just thinking about the fact that, and I haven't seen the other film, so but I know the '90s film has this part played by Ewan McGregor, and I'm just thinking of, like I'd be even more sympathetic if this was Obi-Wan. So yeah, it's interesting because we get like an outsider's perspective on Frank and Jane. So, you know, and I just imagine if we were like on the inside of their story, like, you know, how would it come across to us then? And so, yeah, but yeah, she's especially sympathetic because she seems to be at the end of her tether with putting on this charade. Frank is, as you said, more able to do it, and also like he's a bit more willing to hurt other people to put up this whole charade. So yeah, not gonna put him in the good guy column, but also you can understand the plight they're in, and so it does make him more of a gray character, which I found interesting. And also the fact that, you know, we find out that, you know, obviously his aunt was extraordinarily ill, and, you know, and a lot of people, you know, including Knightley, were doubting, you know, that claim, and so yeah, and I think, yeah, I don't think Knightley completely overcomes his, as Emma calls it earlier, his prejudice uh, against Churchill. Like I said, doesn't do some great things, but also like the way that both he and Jane are kind of dismissed by society, after the truth comes out. I don't find that like entirely fair either. Um, so yeah, I think that's a complex story there, and even though it's not the main focal point of the story, it's more of a subplot. I did appreciate that, that it's kind of shown to be a bit more grayish, and that's actually one of the aspects of like whenever I eventually do read the book that I'd be very interested to maybe get a bit more of that fleshed out.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Mr. Churchill and Jane Fairfax are not the main characters of this movie, so we don't get as much emotional depth with them, and they're kind of dealt with in a line of dialogue off screen, which, is just something the movie has to do because we need to focus on the emotional resolution for our main characters. I do think that they inform our perspective of our main central protagonist, namely Emma and Knightley, because, as you said, Knightley is very prejudiced against Mr. Churchill even before he meets him. It does become clear that part of the reason for that is he clearly sees that Emma is kind of entranced by him and he's jealous. But once Mr. Churchill arrives on the scene, you can kind of see like probably that prejudice was a little bit more well-founded, that, because Mr. Churchill does not treat Mr. Knightley very well. And again, Emma kind of the scales kind of start to fall from her eyes on that front. But also Emma is very dismissive of Jane Fairfax, in part because she's bored about hearing from her from Mrs. Bates from the very beginning. So it becomes clear that like these two people have lived a very different life that is kind of happening over here, and our point of entrance into the story is Emma and Mr. Knightley, so we're not going to get the full story about Mr. Churchill and Jane Fairfax. There is a universe, perhaps, where Jane Austen could have wrote a novel where Mr. Churchill and Jane Fairfax were the main protagonists, and we would have gotten more into their situation. As it is, they are supporting characters, and they ultimately, at the very least, we learn that they do get to be together, which is a good for them. But hopefully, Mr. Churchill in particular, maybe he learns a few lessons. And for God's sake, go to your dad's wedding. That's just a jackass move. What he does.
Yeah, no, I will say, and talking a bit more about Jane Fairfax, who is played by Amber Anderson. Like I thought, the poor girl. She's obviously weighed down a lot by all the subterfuge, that she's having to be a part of. But I thought it was a really good performance, and I love the piano scene where, nobody will ever play so good as you, Emma. And then that jerk to attention when Jane starts. So great. Again, like this movie is so funny. Like even as it deals with really heavy emotions, like it's hilarious at the turn of a dime. And I mentioned the musical score earlier. Actually, even though there's a lot of like period music, like classical tunes and stuff like that, but the way the actual score is used is great, because I find that it actually adds a lot to the comedic timing of everything. So yeah, I just this is just a brilliantly put together film from all the the technical aspects to the music, everything, which by the way, like we haven't mentioned like both the costume design and hair and makeup and all that. Oh my God. Just Emma's whole look in this movie, and the way her hair is done and everything. It's just I think this movie did get Oscar nominations for, it may have been for costume design and hair and makeup.
It got 2 nominations, and those were the exact 2 that it got, which is typical for a kind of period piece in this oeuvre. I think it probably deserved a little bit more. Again, 2020 was a weird year, but it was obviously manifestly deserving of those nominations.
I'm a little bit more annoyed than I usually am at this movie getting, for the most part, ignored, aside from those nominations, because like you figure in such a bare year where I don't even remember like most of the movies that were actually up for consideration that year. It was such a sort of just so few movies came out, but the fact that Emma didn't, rake in major nominations, like I'm always going to be annoyed at the Academy's choices, but I mean, I guess it was just too early in the year, but still.
Yeah, no, I mean the big movies of that. Nomadland won Best Picture that year. Also, The Father, Promising Young Woman, Mank, Minari were some of the big movies that got nominated. In particular, I find it notable that because of the whole pandemic, they extended Oscar eligibility that year. And I always think my favorite movie of 2020 actually came out in 2021, which was Judas and the Black Messiah. But it was because that got nominated in the same cycle as these films. But it's, I think this movie deserved more, to be honest. These types of period pieces are rarely going to get the acclaim that they deserve, unfortunately. Pride and Prejudice got 4 nominations, and
that came out at the end of the year. So, even with all the exposure that it had, it's, I think if this had come out at the end of the year, maybe it could have had a performance, an Oscar performance closer to that, maybe a nomination for Anya Taylor-Joy and a couple more technical awards. But you're right. I mean, we go on and on about how much we adore Pride and Prejudice, and all these years later, it's considered a classic of the genre, and all that got was 4 nominations, and that came out in November. So
and it was but it did get the nomination for Keira Knightley, which is one of my favorite Oscar nominations ever. Sense and Sensibility had gotten 7 nominations. We talked extensively about what an actually impressive feat that not only did that movie get nominated for writing, but it won for Emma Thompson.
Thanks, Eric.
Hey, thanks, Eric. And I do think that part of the reason Emma may have been overlooked was not only the fact that it came out in 2020 and it came out before the pandemic shut everything down, and then it may have gotten lost in the shuffle, but also it's more comedic than the other 2, and the Academy is just not always going to respond to comedies in the same way. This is very much, even though we feel there's incredible depth of emotion in these movies, this is a comedy. This is ultimately a comedy of manners in many ways. And for some, that's not going to be considered as consequential. So it's an unfortunate.
Let's also, let's not forget to mention, and by way of stating this, I'll also say that we have not mentioned her name nearly enough on the stream, if at all. But this is a film, directed by a woman. Autumn de Wilde, and even though there's been strides made, the Academy doesn't have the greatest history with recognizing female directors. Although I just said that term, and somebody posted on Twitter the other day, I think I'm sick of the term female directors, but I was specifically pointing out in this case, I think it was relevant. But no, it's a superbly directed film, and I think this was actually Autumn de Wilde's first film.
This is in fact not only her first film; it is to date her only film that I am aware of. So that is probably another reason that it got overlooked, because sometimes it takes these directors a little bit of time to break through, even regardless of gender.
Yeah, I don't know. It's still going to be, it's going to continue to be one of the most frustrating snubs for me, just because, like I said, because 2020 was such a, a bare year as far as films go, and the fact that I just think this is, it's one of the best films in the past few years, and definitely in the upper tier of Jane Austen adaptations. But yeah, what's new? Me mad at the Academy. Same old story, except for last year.
Yeah, no, they
did good.
They got it right, in our opinion, this past year by awarding Oppenheimer's dominance. And I know that you were happy with Poor Things winning a bunch of awards as well. It was a strong year for film, and sometimes that cream rises to the top. But I won't deny that I do put stock, and I continue to put stock in the Oscars. I still continue to enjoy them, and it doesn't mean that I see them as the ultimate arbiter of quality, but I do like it when movies I love get recognized, and I wish this movie had gotten a little bit more recognition.
Well, I'm very dismissive towards them, and I think they're worthless except for when my favorite movies win. So just let's run through, mention a couple other people. You briefly mentioned Gemma Whelan as Mrs. Weston, or formerly Miss Taylor. The movie starts off with Bill Nighy screaming, "Miss Taylor!" and no, it's so funny because I always see Gemma Whelan playing, in these period, films and TV shows, these really sweet characters. Then I look at her in Game of Thrones playing Yara, and I'm like, oh my god, it's such a great casting against type there.
Yeah, and what's actually funny is that, like, apparently she actually is more known for these types of comedies. It just so happens that the first thing I ever saw her in was Game of Thrones, so she is now and forever Yara Greyjoy first and foremost in my mind. And anything movie where she shows up in a period in a dress, I'm like, what? But she is great in this movie in a very small role, but it is notable that, like, the movie opens with her getting married to Mr. Weston, and we see that, like, Anya Taylor-Joy as Emma is, like, sincerely upset by this, because she basically sees this woman as a mother figure, and she's losing her, not losing her permanently, but, like, she's moving out of the house, and that's kind of a catalyst for her to go seeking a new companion, which she finds Harriet. Obviously, the loss affects Mr. Woodhouse as well, because he's very much not okay with change. And I love the scene where he is like, "There's a draft. Miss Taylor felt it."
And then, of course, that comes back at the end of the movie, with Nighy, and he's like, "Do you feel a draft?" And it's all pretense just to give the two of them some privacy. But she's great. It's a small role, but but just given that we recognize her so easily from Game of Thrones, so I wanted to make sure to mention her. And and speaking of which, the actor Rupert Graves plays Mr. Weston, which cracked me up, because anytime I see I see him in something, I'm just always thinking of his role in Sherlock. He plays Lestrade, and and so I always just view him as this sort of behind the curve, not completely ineffectual inspector, but but no match for Sherlock.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the poor guy is, once again always like expecting his son to come, and it's like, oh no, I've just gotten a letter. He's not coming.
Yeah. Until he does, and then you're like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe he would have stayed away. Yeah, no, watching this movie, like when I saw Rupert Graves as Mr. Weston, I had the quintessential like, I know that guy. Who's that guy? What, like, where have I seen him before? And it took me like till halfway through the movie, and I had to pause and go to IMDb. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember him from Sherlock. I blanked on that totally, but yes, he's one of those types of character actors who does very well with this type of material.
He also had a role in V for Vendetta.
Oh yeah, no, and that actually I remembered him from that too. That movie is great, and he's good in it. So,
Which, that's one that I feel like we're gonna have to carve out a spot to.
absolutely. But I figure there might be a specific date. It might be a good idea to do that.
Yeah, you know what? I just looked up. Sadly, November the 5th does not fall on a Sunday this year, but that's okay.
Yeah.
We'll fudge it a little bit.
Yeah, we can. I have been pretty as great and influential as The Matrix is. I've been pretty unapologetic that V for Vendetta is actually my favorite Wachowski's movie. So, so I would be happy to talk about that one.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite films and one of my favorite Natalie Portman performances. She's just incredible in that, and not to mention Hugo Weaving. Uh, as B, but we'll get off track there. We'll save all that for that discussion, which you heard it here first. We're going to set a week aside in November for that one. Yeah. Anything else, major that we didn't touch on?
I do think we should, being the sappy romantics at heart that we are, we should devote a little bit of dedicated time to actually discussing the scene that we've alluded to, but not delved in fully, which is the confession of love from Mr. Knightley to Emma, because it is very much in the grand tradition of Jane Austen, romantic heroes confessing their eternal love to romantic heroines. It is, every bit as passionate, perhaps pitched slightly more comedically, with, as you alluded to, the fact that when he pours his heart out to her, her reaction is not like as a would have said, well then, and to kiss his hand and bring their foreheads together, but oh, and then she starts bleeding from the nose, which is funny, but it is so very romantic.
And then she's like, no, I can't.
Yeah.
And he's like, why not? And Harriet. And he's like, what are you talking about? Because that poor guy has no idea what's been going on that corner of the story. No, it's so beautiful. That line, if I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more. Oh, jeez, talk about your all-time great lines. No, it's so great because again, it's like it's the culmination of this love that's been there all along. And as you pointed out, he's been more aware of it than she has. Maybe subconsciously, she's known, but not at the forefront. Whereas for him, I think he's just been sort of pining forever. Which poor Johnny Flynn, he seems to get stuck with with those roles. Just yeah, and so and so as he starts to come out with it, and she's like, maybe you should not speak, and then she runs over into him, and it's like, or if you would speak to me, speak as, a friend, and then he's wounded by that, and he's like, yeah, that word, Emma, and just building up to, the full declaration. It's wonderful. It's, if it's, as much as, I love the whole, enemies to lovers trope, and this has a little touch of that because they're very, they're shown to be antagonistic towards each other, but it's also like, they're also extremely close friends. And so that's another trope which I just adore. This, sort of these two, people who have been so close and, in one respect, but then realize the depth of their feelings for each other. And yeah, it's so beautiful. Um, and
Yeah, and
go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say that it pays off their relationship throughout the movie because at this point, another Jane Austen staple is the heroine has realized that she is now in love with the dashing suitor, but there is now a circumstance where she thinks he's in love with somebody else, so she is going to let him out of the goodness of her heart, go be with the woman she thinks he really loves, and she will suffer in silence. And then, of course, the hero comes and makes the big romantic profession of, no, actually, I am in love with you. And as Anya Taylor-Joy would say, oh, that is the moment when she when it actually is all out in the open. But I do appreciate that in addition to that line that you talked about, if I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more. But that it continues, and he says, but you know what I am. I have lectured you, I have blamed you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England could have borne it. God knows I've been a very indifferent lover, but you understand me. You understand my feelings. Will you marry me? And it's very much, again, not the most sweeping, and it's certainly not, Mr. Darcy's speech to Elizabeth at crossing the field in Pride and Prejudice, but very few movies are ever going to measure up to that, so that's okay. But it does paying off the idea that Mr. Knightley throughout this movie has been lecturing Emma and trying to make her better, and calling her out on her crap, and recognizing when she's cruel and stepping away from her. But the entire time, he has not abandoned her. He has never reached the point where he was like, I actually don't think this woman is worthy of my affections. He has the entire time been doing this because he loves her and he wants to be with her. He just wants her to realize that she can be better than this. She can be less selfish and self-centered, and less cruel in her manipulations of other people. And she has, like, she has arrived at that point. Like, we see her, after all this is unfolded, that she feels terrible remorse for what she's done to Harriet. She wants to make it right. Ultimately, she does make it right. And she is, and she would have been willing, if Harriet was truly in love with Mr. Knightley and he wasn't actually in love with her, she would have been willing to set aside her own heart to allow them to be together. But she doesn't have to, because that's the way Jane Austen stories work. And now they actually, they have that moment where it's a release of their affections, and it's perhaps less sweeping in their pronouncement than, again, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth meeting in the field with the heads touching, or Eleanor breaking down into tears when she finally realizes she's going to be able to be with Mr. Ferrars. But it is the same core idea that, like, these people have finally gone through their trials and now they can't contain their feelings anymore. They're going to open up their hearts, and they realize that the other person does feel the same, and now we get to be together. So it proves to be a very satisfying resolution.
Mr. Knightley strikes me as, I like, if you know, you have a story within a Jane Austen story within a Jane Austen story, like, like, he'd be like, I'm no Mr. Darcy, and like, this is a guy who like doesn't have like the gift of knowing exactly the right words to say, although, I still think they end up being pretty damn good words. Um, but yeah, but he's the guy who thinks that he doesn't stand a chance, and there's something so endearing, about that. And I think one of my favorite moments from him really comes at like after the scene. Like they've still got some obstacles to like overcome. Like she's got to go deal with the situation with Harriet and Robert Martin, but because they've laid their feelings for each other out on the table, and once like she gets through with that, then they'll be able to then address being together themselves. So even before all of that's resolved, she goes off to deal with it, and then he goes, like big fist pump in the air. He's just so happy because everything's out in the open now, and she knows how he feels, and he knows how she feels. So yeah, it's a beautiful moment.
Yeah, and that is another element of the movie being much more like modern in its sensibilities, and that like, in some of the more traditional Jane Austen adaptations, like the romantic hero is going to confess his undying love for the beautiful heroine, and then they are going to have a very chaste, either kiss or hand holding or proposal in an idyllic setting, which is beautiful, and we love those stories. But it's also not very true to life. In real life, you tell somebody who you had a crush on for a long time that you love them, and then they return your affections. What are you going to do? Probably as soon as they're out of sight. Yes, that is much more of an accurate affection.
Oh God, yeah. It had that same kind of release as it reminds me of the kiss moment at the end of Return of the King between Aragorn and Arwen, where you're anticipating this very like reserved, proper, kiss between the two, and then he just rushes in. It's a huge big kiss. It's that kind of emotional release. Yeah. No, it's such a beautiful scene, but like the scene that really gets me is the last one before the church, when when Mr. West has the servants keep putting up more and more barriers between them. And and then just starts with the hand holding, and then with her saying I couldn't possibly leave him, and then him saying that he's gonna come and stay with them, and it's just so beautiful. And then I don't know if we would have actually gotten them kissing repeatedly in a traditional Jane Austen adaptation until after the wedding, but you know what, it felt right in this movie. So.
You know what, we are on record about this, or at least I am. Let people kiss in Jane Austen movies. I will die on the hill that the ending of Pride and Prejudice, the American ending where Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth kiss on the balcony, is the real ending of the movie, and any British nonsense about cutting it off right after the proposal scene is just bunk. Let people kiss in Jane Austen movies. They're some of the best romances we have. We deserve that payoff. Hell, even the 1995 British Pride and Prejudice ends with a kiss, which may not be book accurate. I don't care. And this is, again, a more modern Jane Austen adaptation. It's more irreverent. It shows us some of the elements that perhaps would not have been as focused on in a more traditional adaptation, both in this romantic respect, but also in just, if talk, we alluded to a little bit, some of the beats of the fact, well, these people are wearing very stylized clothes, and these clothes are very uncomfortable, and their manners are very like stilted, and sometimes it's just freaking awkward. Like, I love the scene where he comes into his drawing room after he's had this big emotional scene with Emma, and he takes off like some of his clothes, and he just lies on the floor, and then his butler comes in and sees him lying there and turns around and leaves. Very true to life. And also, it's but like the idea that like Emma, like, when she gets dressed in her fancy dress, and she's like, I'm cold, and she hikes up her dress to like get warm by the fire. It's like, this shit would not be in another Jane Austen movie, but it's funny, and it's very true to life, because sometimes these comedy of manners, funny to us because we're not used to those affectations, and it is worthwhile for the movie to like point out that some of the stuff, there's a reason we don't do it anymore, because it's awkward, but it doesn't mean the power of the story is any less.
Yeah, no, I love the things that they do, like, because it's one of those things that you can do with adaptation where you want to be true to the source with like the dialogue, and you want to stick to that Jane Austen dialogue, but it's two things that are very important. One with the actual dialogue is inflection, and how you're saying those lines, but also like then visual things that don't involve the lines, to add some more levity or comedy, or a different slant to things. And yeah, reading the book will be a very interesting experience after, coming to this story through this film. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm glad that this was, even though I haven't seen the other ones yet, but I'm still glad like this was my entry point into the story of Emma, because I just love the style of the film, and the sense of humor it has, and the irreverent quality and the more modern bent. I just I think it's a wonderful film, and it's so hilarious. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm sure we could go through and find all the different lines of dialogue and beats that just made me laugh. I did, watching this movie again yesterday, I was like, the first half of the movie, I was just constantly cackling at like little like affectations and line readings from the entire cast, and I was thinking to myself like, I remember this movie actually being pretty emotional, but right now it's just a straight up comedy. And then
I have the same experience.
Yeah, but by the end, it actually you start to get more of the pathos, but it is still funny, so it's a good balance.
Yeah. Oh God. No, I'm really glad we talked about this movie, and I got the chance to revisit it, and I'll probably watch it again with the director's commentary track on. Yeah, it's just again, like I said before, it's one of my favorite movies of the past few years, and sometimes I just like I like to go back to Pride and Prejudice when I need to feel, then this is the same way, except with this, it's more if I need to laugh and then cry.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's, but yeah, and I'll just, as we start to close out, I'll just say, again, that, because this was, the first, like proper live action film that I saw Anya Taylor-Joy, and I'm actually really, really happy about that, because it probably still is like my favorite project of hers, even though she's done obviously some incredible stuff, and I've since seen The Witch. I've seen Queen's Gambit. Probably seen a couple other things. I can't remember them just yet, but I've still got some more to see. But she's an incredible, very versatile actress, but I'm glad that I got to see her do this first, because this is a very comedic, heartfelt turn, whereas a lot of her stuff is actually very dark and foreboding.
Yeah. It remains an outlier in her filmography to date. She is much more like, she is kind of cultivated the reputation as more of a genre queen, a screen queen, but a great actress overall. I do think she's going to continue to break through and get higher profile projects. I've not had a chance to see Furiosa yet. That bums me out, but I do think, I was glad she took on that project. My favorite work of hers is still and will remain The Witch. That's going to be a high bar to clear. I love, but this would probably be second, and Thoroughbred is up there as well. I mean, Dune Part 2 is obviously great, but, she has a smaller role in that. And Last Night in Soho as well. Hell, I even liked her in The New Mutants, So I think that she is just can rarely do any wrong, but this is one of her most complex and enriching performances.
I will say that she is probably the entire reason I ended up going to see Last Night in Soho, because what, if anybody hasn't seen that movie, it's just amazing. But the teaser for that film was one of the best teaser trailers I've ever seen, and the way it transitions into showing her character in the past, and just the dance number that she does with Matt Smith, who is despicable in that movie. It has to be said, because normally he plays such charmers. Although a lot of people do know him for Doctor Who, so maybe. But yeah, just her presence in that teaser, as well as the design of the look of the movie, sold me on that. So yeah, I think that was also one of the first things that I saw her in.
Yeah. Oh, and Mother Royne is pointing out in the chat she was good in The Northman as well.
Yeah.
We love that movie. We talked about it on this channel, and she's outstanding in it as well.
But yeah, I mean, you're right. You list it, and it is, so much of it is genre stuff. Even the first thing that I was exposed to with her, Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, it doesn't get much more genre than that. Which again, I know I said it at the beginning, but you guys have no concept of how weird it was for me to hear Princess Breia's voice coming out of this human actress.
Yeah, we've covered several. Laura, you were on one of those discussions.
Yeah, I can't tell if this is sarcastic or not. You should definitely see this, Laura, because it's absolutely fantastic. But yeah, and then what else was I? Oh yeah, Furiosa. Yeah, I'll just say, Jared, even though you haven't seen it yet, I loved it, and everybody can have all the discourse in the world about the box office performance and all that, but I thought it was an incredible, an incredible tribute to Fury Road, and a great prequel, and I thought she just knocked it out of the park. I mean, it can't have been easy to. Okay, yeah. But it's I can't imagine it would have been easy for anybody to step into the role that Charlize Theron did in Fury Road, but like as soon as they announced that Anya Taylor-Joy was going to be cast, as the young Furiosa, I was like, oh yeah, that's going to work, and I'm happy to say that it lived up to expectations. And by the way, in addition to her, and, what's his name? Chris Hemsworth. Oh my God. Like, if you guys, for those of you who haven't seen the movie yet, he is like out of this world, batshit insane in Furiosa. So, yeah. It's anybody who, if it's still playing in a theater near you, go watch it because it's great.
I will get out and see it once I've just been a little too busy to go out to the theater, but I do want to support the movie, and I do want to, continue to observe Anya Taylor-Joy's star rising, because I do think she is one of the best actresses that we have working, and she is obviously stunningly gorgeous in most movies, and this movie in particular. So I think she will continue to find projects that make use of her talents, and as long as she continues to make these kind of interesting choices, I'm always going to love when she collaborates with Robert Eggers, for instance. But I do hope that eventually she'll do another movie kind of in line with Emma, because again, this is, as of now, kind of more of an outline of her filmography, but it's a credit to her that she's as great in it as she is.
Yep, and I will just follow up on what you said. I was very much trying to be more well behaved this week after. I think we may have gone a little over the edge last week with Natalie, but yes, Anya Taylor-Joy is extraordinarily beautiful in pretty much every movie, and especially so in this one. But I say that as respectfully as possible. But yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I adored this movie, and loved getting to watch it again, and yeah, I don't think I have anything else to say. I think we covered just about everything.
Yep, and we kept it at 2.5 hours, which I told you we would. I told you it would be shorter when we weren't talking about Star Wars or Keira Knightley or Lord of the Rings.
Well, plus, as we also discussed, there's, there certainly is a lot to talk about in this movie, but it also, like, it's not something like, obviously last week with Star Wars, the Star Wars universe has so much depth to it that, layers upon layers of story that can be, discussed and drawn out. So, so it made sense. Which, by the way, as you pointed out, that was our longest, the longest stream you and I have ever done together. So, so I think it only made sense that we eased back off a little bit this week. But then we will see how we do when we come back in 2 weeks for Revenge of the Sith, because oh boy. But yeah, so anyway, I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I hope you guys had a good time. Like I said, loved getting to talk about this movie, and yeah. Just once again, previewing what's ahead. As I said, we're taking next week off for Father's Day, and then the week after we'll be talking about Revenge of the Sith. And then tentatively the week after that, it's looking like we'll be talking about Black Swan, and then, we'll kind of play it by ear after that. But on the horizon, afterwards, we're going to be going back to, what's the next one? Before Sunset?
Yeah, so we had mentioned Before Sunset, Blade Runner 2049 as part of our revisited series, Anna Karenina, and then The Acolyte at some point before, like, Logan and that stuff. So we'll figure out the exact dates, because we'll have to shift things around because we're taking next week off. But we will get to all of those movies eventually, and many others besides. So stick with us.
Yeah. See, yes, I do have it in I do have it in me. Oh God. But you know, it would have been a whole nother story if we were talking about Dark Crystal, man. I'd be showing those puppet pictures. Sorry, I don't know. I'm getting loopy, guys. It's the end of the stream. Nobody else found that funny except for me. But anyway, yeah. Thank you guys again for tuning in. Hope you have a great night, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.